My country, the United States, is today at war with itself. Its political system is far from the envy of anyone else in the world. Deep-pocketed interest groups are distorting law and policymaking to create a system that represents dollars over its own citizens. And no matter who wins on November 5th, tens of millions of Americans will find evidence that their political system is broken. And they are not wrong about that. The post-election period is uniquely dangerous, as we are about to have an election whose outcome will be perceived as illegitimate by nearly half of the country.
Nearly half of America is going to view whatever the results of this election turn out to be, whether we find out tomorrow night, as used to be the case, or if it drags out some number of days, it's unclear. But no matter how it comes out, at least half the country is going to feel like they were cheated. And that is going to turn into some real problems. Now, most of the time when you hear, like the title of this episode, the potential for civil war is real. You know, I have to admit, even myself, even as I'm preparing for this, you think, okay, it's not like the Yanks and the Confederacy of the 1863, like that's going to happen. There's no North and South Army, et cetera. So yeah, there could be some political instability, but there's not going to be a civil war. That's what you think. But when you start to actually look at the fundamentals, and this is what we do on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. That's what we've done for the Russia-Ukraine war, for the war in the Middle East between Israel and all of its opponents here. And we always look at the fundamentals, the things that go into how combat power is built at the national level. And then you look at this two sides, et cetera. You look at the positions of the two sides, et cetera, and all that kind of stuff, and leads you to understand how and why those wars are being waged and why one side is succeeding and how the outcome may turn out. It's a logical process. When you take the emotion out of it and you just look at the evidence, then you can see, yes, this makes sense. I understand why this is going on, and here's where it's likely to go. We're applying that same methodology here today, and you should be more worried than you probably have been up to this point. What happened on January 6th was a flash in the pan, according to many, but it could be just the next point in a continuing to deteriorate path that could take us into somewhere very dark. And and I'm going to show you very graphically throughout this episode why there is a risk of a civil war, where the battle lines may be drawn, how it may play out, and at the end, here are some things that we might can do to mitigate some of that stuff, because until something happens, it's always possible that it won't. I'm not going to predict that a civil war is going to happen, but I am going to show you that the chances are much higher than I'm comfortable with. And after you see this, you'll probably be not very comfortable with it either. And that's why it's so important to have a show like this to illuminate there is a real risk here, and we need to take sober calculation of what's at stake and how our actions may contribute to deterioration, or our actions may contribute to lessening of the problems. Again, until something happens, there's still a chance for us to avoid some of the worst outcomes. But one of the first things that Ian Bremmer said at the beginning of that first clip there was that America is at war with itself. That was a present tense statement he made, and that is echoed in a book by Stephen March called The Next Civil War, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail throughout the rest of this episode here. But in that, he basically argues, and by the way, I strongly recommend you read this book. We have a link to it in the description. He argues that we're already in the early phases. He said if people go back, he said if the United States ends up in a new civil war, historians will look back and they'll try to start tracing how it happened, like we did for the original Civil War, which he outlines in the book. And you can see at what point it was inevitable, et cetera. And one of the interesting things he put in there is that even in the U.S. Civil War, the one in 1863, up until even after the first battle had been fought, the storming of the arms at Sumter, the arms depot at Sumter, even at that point, he said most people in the United States on both sides still didn't think that a civil war was inevitable. They thought that it would be maybe the beginning of something or maybe just a flash in the pan. But even then, they didn't think it was inevitable. But when we look back at it now, we can go all the way back to John Brown's rebellion and going back to bloody Kansas and all kinds of things. And we can say, oh, yeah, all of that led right up to the Civil War, and it was plain as day. Well, he uses that same methodology in assessing the United States now. And in his argument is that many of those same things are already happening that can be viewed as the beginnings of the Civil War having already started. Sides being divided, preparations being made, as many are doing already right now. And you can see that as we get through. And that's one of the concerns that I have. But let's look, first of all, at the proximal issue that faces us right now. Tomorrow is the presidential election for the United States. And in my lifetime, I have never seen polling this close on the eve of the election. This is basically the 538 compilation of many of the biggest polls you see. If you can see, I don't know if you can see the writing on there, but Harris is on this one at 49, Trump 48, and then each of those are the 7 battlegrounds below. And you can see on there that I think less than 2 points separates all 7 of them. And those are the states that are at most at play. And unless there's any shock, it's going to be, these 7 will determine who wins. And I want to say that I think that Trump has to must win 4 of them, or Harris has to win only 3 of them or something like, based on the rest of them have to, for one of them to get to 270. So it's gonna really come down to how these are, and every single one of them could be a coin flip. The latest NBC News poll from just this morning actually has it at an absolute dead heat, 49-49. I'm not a historian of all American elections, so I don't know. Perhaps it has been close at other times, but I have certainly in my lifetime, and I'm 61 years old, I have never seen a literal coin flip on the eve of the election. So you know that obviously this represents, just by the numbers themselves, a very divided America. But as we're going to see, it's actually a lot worse than that. It's not just that the numbers are divided, but it's that the 2 camps are night and day difference. There was a famous speech by Barack Obama in 2004, which is really when he hit the national scene for the first time. And he gave this really famous speech, which I'll just tell you, in my opinion, from a purely speech-giving point of view, that was one of the finest speeches in modern American history. The most amazing, opportunistic, and optimistic view that, there is not a red and blue America. There is not a black and white America. There's only the United States of America, et cetera. And he went on with a lot of rhetorical flourish and just exploded the audience there. They just loved it. Many people did, up across the aisle even. But the reality is, it was at that time, to an extent, but it is nothing like what it is today. There is a red America and there is a blue America, and they are radically different. Those numbers there you showed, 49-49. So it makes it look like this, but I think the better analogy is something like this. Those 49 on the left are way to the left. The 49 on the right are way over to the right. And there's very little crossover and bleed over in the middle. And in fact, part of the problem why the post-election period is going to be very dangerous is because the partisans on each side, even though the numbers you just saw are right down the middle, both sides think they're going to win. And in fact, large numbers think that they're going to win big. There are several you see there on this particular poll here, where both parties see that they're kind of 87% of Republicans and 90% of Democrats are sure their side's going to win, and 28% of Democrats and 38% of Republicans think that it's not even going to be close. Now, you take an election that take the emotion out of it by the numbers, it's going to come down to a hair's breadth difference between whoever wins. And yet you have partisans on either side thinking that they're going to win big. I mean, there's even some news out there that says that for those who support Kamala, it's going to be a landslide. I just, for the life of me, cannot understand how, given the numbers here, that you can think that there's even a possibility that you're going to hit a landslide. Same is true on the right. Trish Regan, a big Trump supporter, I had one of her podcasts where she's talking about, this predicted landslide victory. And of course, she continued to support that and gave all of her reasons why that's going to be. There's many others as well. But there's not going to be a landslide, or at least unless something really crazy happens, which I can't imagine. It's going to come down to probably, again, having recounts. There's going to be almost certainly going to be legal challenges. You can just imagine any state where it's like really literally close and like less than 1% somewhere, that the side that lost is going to claim they were cheated. They were going to claim irregularities. They'll come up with all kinds of evidence to support their side. It'll be like wildfire going on the internet. Social media will be just going crazy with all this stuff, and the advocates will absolutely believe it. Just imagine if you have a third or more of each side thinking they're going to win in a landslide, and instead their side barely loses, then of course it was cheating, right? I mean, there's no other possibility in their minds. And so you have the possibility of some real problems in violence after the election. We all know what happened on January 6th. I don't need to recount that. But that was like level one. The tender and how volatile things are going into this one makes it a lot worse. And it's not even just that the numbers are both, or that the two sides think different. Folks, they hate each other. Both of these sides actually think that the threat to the nation's well-being is at risk if the other side wins. 36% of Republicans see the Democratic Party as a threat to the nation's well-being, and 27% of Democrats. And that's going to be kind of a trend that you'll see on a lot of these polls, that the right is further along than the left in the hatred, but not that much. The left is coming along, and even if I think that it's reasonable to say, if Trump were to lose this, the risk of post-election violence is much higher than if Trump wins. And part of the reason is because the left is not as far along yet in their hatred of the right, and not as far along in the preparations as some of the right are. But it's only in degrees. And I promise you, especially in this election, if the left were to lose, their motivation will go sky high towards anything in the future to turn it around. And here's part of the problem, as we've already been seeing from the 2020 election. If people lose faith in the institutions of the United States, that they don't think that elections are free and fair, that they think that the other side cheated in order to get a win, and still large numbers. I think I saw a poll recently that somewhere around 80% of Republicans to this day still think that the election was stolen and they were cheated in 2020. Now, just imagine if something happens in this one when they think that there's going to be a landslide, some large percentage of them. They're going to lose confidence that change can be. It's not like it has been my entire lifetime. And in the history of America, where if you lost an election, now then you're just going to say, all right, well, we made some mistakes. We had a dumb campaign. We'll fire the campaign manager. We'll do better next time. And they already start planning their next process to win the next election. That's how it's always been, because you accept that the country is fair, that the elections are an accurate reflection of the country. So you set about finding, well, we need better policies, we need better messaging, et cetera. But on the day to where you conclude, actually, it doesn't matter about the policies, it doesn't matter about anything because it's not fair, we can no longer count on elections to obtain a better outcome. Ergo, we have to resort to violence. That is the danger. You're hating each other on one thing, but then at the same time, there's also a diminishing by both sides, by both of these actions. We keep diminishing the credibility of our institutions. Where this has been going back many administrations, even back to the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, Trump administration, and certainly the Biden administration. All of the opponents keep saying you're turning the presidency into an imperial presidency, and you're ruling by fiat, and you're bypassing the Constitution. And the trust in Congress continues to dwindle and deteriorate. Now then, the judiciary is starting to come under fire. People don't trust it. It's not political. The law enforcement capabilities in the United States is under increasing threat and losing credibility. People think it's being used as a tool against Trump right now. And there's some evidence that maybe there is some truth to that. But then you also have Trump. If he wins, he's claiming he'll do the same thing on the other side. And I assure you, if whatever happens on the other side, anytime someone goes after a political opponent, then they'll say that's the further weaponizing of the FBI, for example, or the Justice Department. And you see, you keep dwindling away. When enough Americans on any side, and possibly even both, conclude that the institutions that have governed us for 2+ centuries is no longer strong enough to get a fair outcome as they view fair, then you can see where violence is the next place here. Now, I mentioned the Stephen March book earlier, The Next Civil War. Like I said, strongly recommend you go read this. I'm going to show you a couple of clips from some interviews that he's had recently. And in this first one here, kind of along the lines of what we've been talking about, he says that the conditions for a civil war are present right now.
The United States is a textbook case of a country headed for civil war. It has all the attributes that lead to what the sociologists and economists and historians call a complex cascading system: hyperpartisanship, environmental degradation, high levels of inequality, and low levels of solidarity, as well as, declining faith in institutions and a rising tendency to violence. And, more or less what I see broadly is a struggle over the meaning of America, and that expressing itself through violence.
And that last part I want to zero in on here, because that's really the issue. I mentioned earlier the 2004 Obama speech where he says there's not a red America and a black blue America, but a United States of America, et cetera. But there is a red and blue America. And I, even in just within the span of my own lifetime, I can look back and now I was born in 1963, so I wasn't obviously aware of the Kennedy campaign during that time with Nixon, et cetera. But I have read back through them, and I obviously have watched all the ones really since my high school days on forward. And you could see that there were, in most cases, a general agreement on what the United States was, who the United States was, what our character, what our morals, what our values were. And then there were differences on how best to accomplish that. We said, everybody wants a good economy. Everybody deserves freedom and fairness, those kinds of things. And we wanted to keep us safe overseas, So there was broad agreements on the fundamentals, just differences of agreement on how policy-wise to get there. But that started changing as we went through. I remember certainly a lot of it started in the Clinton administration when there was this hatred of Clinton by the Republicans. And then as soon as Bush got in there, they used that opportunity to finally undo a lot of the stuff for Clinton. And then the Democrats really hated Bush, and anything Bush did, they didn't want to do. And when Obama came in, just like Bush had done, he undid a lot of the stuff that Bush had done. A lot of the animosity just continued on. And that was one of the first times I remember, at least in my experience, where one side accused the other of hating America. Obama hated America. So they continued to say. And then likewise in verse. And the truth is, Obama never hated America. Nobody in either one of the parties hates America. They just don't like your version of America. And that's the key. Both sides will say and mean genuinely to their hearts, I love America. I love this America. The other side, I love that America. And that is whereas what I saw growing up mostly has now split apart. And now then the views of Americans are very, very different. And now that it's fundamental differences over what America is and who we are, not just the general agreements and then the policies. Now then, even the fundamentals themselves are very different. For example, you have on the rights, on the right side, of course, you have, gun support, the support for guns, the Second Amendment. You want to say we want a conservative viewpoint on moral issues. And then on the left, naturally they're against the guns. They want all the guns supported, controlled. They are very pro-abortion. They're very pro for diversity, DEI, all that kind of stuff. The right is definitely opposed to DEI, et cetera. And so now then you're seeing that there's just this real irreconcilable difference between the two. So the folks on Red America, they don't want to be governed by anybody on Blue America because their values, their actual values as a nation are dramatically different. And as I showed you that clip a second ago, or that poll, they view each other as existential threats to the country. Let that sink in for a second. We're not talking about we think China is an existential threat, or Russia and their nuclear weapons are an existential threat, or North Korea, China, Iran, any of those people. Each other. Now, if you view an entity as an existential threat, I mean, by definition, that means the chances of violence are going to be growing. See, that never existed in the political discourse, at least in the early part of my life. And really, you can say up until about 2001, I think is when things, after 9/11, this things started really kind of splitting apart. And that's when we started viewing each other differently. Now then, the risk of actual interstate fighting is good. One of the interesting things that Marsh says in his book, when he lays out a lot of the details, and it's way more than I can go into in this show here. So that's why I recommend you reading it. You can see for yourself. But he's saying that so many of these things are not speculative. He doesn't, guess about what may happen in many regards. He does a little bit, but he caveats it by saying these are based on evidence. And the vast majority of the book are based on fundamentals and facts that happen right now, things that exist today, things that are right there. And he makes this really important point that I wanted to highlight here. He says people don't see these things because they don't want to see these things. Nobody wants their country to end. They want their version of a red or a blue America to exist over the whole country. They want their side to run it because they think that's how a good country is to be run. But when you see that there are these irreconcilable divides, instead of working and doing the hard work to bring them together, they keep on saying, no, I just don't see that. It's not going to happen. So instead of anyone making any compromises or softening into their positions here, they think, no, I'm just going to press harder, not realizing that doing so could cause the very rupture in the fabric of the country that could lead folks to think that violence is now the only way. And we're going to get to that in a second as well. That's a bigger danger than many realize as well. I want to go back to March, though, because one of the other things he says, especially kind of heading into this election here, is that the conditions are like a tinderbox ready to blow up.
The point of the book is really that America political landscape right now is very dry tinder. It is rife with the possibility of violence, and less than 20% of Americans have faith in their electoral system. A recent poll said that 33% of Americans believe that violence against your own government is sometimes warranted. You have these conditions that are ripe for conflict, and which we've seen everywhere else in the world. Right? America is an exceptional country, but it also doesn't really defy the laws of gravity, and it doesn't defy the laws of political gravity. And so it is now coming. It's sown the wind, and it's about to reap the whirlwind.
That's one of the things that concerns me. We have sown to the wind in this political division, and he fears we are about to reap the whirlwind. That was 2 years ago. So this has had more time to germinate and to get even worse. And you heard him in there. He talked about, and we're going to hear more of this subsequent, that in his polling that he was talking about there, 33% of Americans view the willingness or the justifiableness of using violence to accomplish your view is growing. And again, you see 33%. That is a huge percentage of the adult population. And you just don't see that because we don't want to. We don't want to say, and that means that this thing could blow up, because we don't want it. We don't want that to happen. So we go, okay, yeah, that's a kind of high number. But anyway, on to what I want here, because we can't connect those two dots in our minds. It's so difficult to say, yes, the risk of war inside America is so high because we are the exceptional country. We are the indispensable nation, as many love to say about ourselves. And really, that's on both sides of the divide here. They both think that we're you've had Democratic and Republican administrations say the exact same thing. So that is one of the things that's kind of unique, spread across both sides here, is that we think we're this incredible country. You've heard Biden say, we're the most powerful nation in the history of the world. Trump said versions of the same thing, as did Obama and Bush before that. And so you have this idea that, well, That may happen overseas, Sudan, South Sudan, all these different places where there's civil wars going on in parts of the world. That's because, well, they're not as good as us, or they're not as smart as we are. That's certainly not going to happen here. And that arrogance of thought ignores the growing physical realities that it is. And now I want to shift to another person who's written a book about this, Barbara Walters. She's a former CIA officer, wrote How Civil Wars Start. And before I show you this next clip here, she had been assigned to his task force that was designed by the CIA, which can only look overseas. It can't do anything to the United States. There's a firewall there, at least there's supposed to be, that they can't look at the United States. But she said that they were trained, or this task force she was on, to look at the fundamentals and do some research into identifying risks of other states outside of the United States that were at risk of civil war. And they found a bunch of fundamentals that say, when these factors exist and this percentage is there, then they are at high risk of a war. Well, she, in her own capacity, one day just kind of looked around and went, hang on, we're tasked to look overseas, but when I look at the United States, I see some big red flags. So she left the CIA and ended up writing this book. Here's what she had to say.
If the task force had been allowed to monitor and study the United States, it likely would have considered it at high risk of political instability and political violence in December of 2020, just a few weeks before the January 6th insurrection, and it likely would have put the United States on the watch list.
So that was 4 years ago, what she's identifying there. And if those fundamentals that existed then had been examined, then people might not have been surprised by what happened on January 6th. Now, I'll admit, I was surprised on what happened on January 6th. I heard about the meeting that Trump was going to have there on that day. I remember, it was in the news all over the place. I'm here in Washington, D.C., so it was, up close and personal for us. And I thought it was going to be a rally like so many others, that he was going to make some speeches and there would be a lot of cheering, whatever, and then they would go their separate ways. I had no earthly idea that they would then turn to the Capitol based on what the president said, and that it would turn into violence. There were those who were surprised, who were not surprised, who did see this thing coming. And the fundamentals have expanded between then and now. Now, one of the other interesting things in the Barbara Walter book is that she's talking about who's involved with this. Now, kind of a lot of the idea and a lot of the caricatures of what's coming off is there's that big famous picture of the guy with horns and a guy sitting on the desk of Nancy Pelosi. Looks like a lot of ne'er-do-wells and just kind of the ruffians and just kind of the lower part of society, or the dead-enders, people with no jobs, that kind of thing. But she says actually an examination of who starts these kind of things are not the kind of people you may think.
We also know who tends to start civil wars, and again, it's not the people most of us think. It is not the poorest people in society. It is not the people who are most oppressed by their government. The people who tend to start civil wars, especially ethnically based civil wars, are the groups that had once been politically dominant but are in decline. If you think back to the former Yugoslavia, Serbs had enjoyed most of the positions in government and the military throughout the Cold War for decades. But they were the ones who stood to lose the most as Yugoslavia democratized. The Serbs started that war. Iraq's Sunnis similarly enjoyed most of the key positions in the military and in government under Saddam Hussein. But when the United States toppled Saddam Hussein, they also threw the Sunnis out of their positions. It was the Sunnis who started that war.
And listen, I can just tell you from some firsthand knowledge that I had of being in Iraq during that period of time, where it was the Sunnis against the Shia, and there was still, even at the time that I was there, still some of the lingering effects of that, basically what turned out to be a civil war after Saddam Hussein fell. and some study I've done on the past. The one of the common comments from the United States has always been in terms of this war that exploded in 2005 that, well, the Sunnis and the Shia, they've been at each other's throats for 1,000 years. I mean, they're always against each other, so no one's surprised here. But when you look at actually the performance and the behavior of the folks, it wasn't that way earlier on. In fact, prior to this, Saddam had found a way to make people want to live together. He also used a brutal hand to kill anyone who was against him. But in terms of the Sunni and Shia, they had found a stasis. I won't say they were at peace, but they had found a stasis, and they were working together. There was an interracial, their religious marriage that were going forth. They were fine. Neighbors lived together. There was, like, especially around the Mosul area, there was the Sunni, there was Shia, there was Christians, and they were all living at relative peace to each other. They had even some intermarriages even between those sects as well, until it changed, until all of a sudden the Sunnis, who were in the predominant power positions, lost it because of the toppling Hussein, and then us putting in the Shia, because we said, well, we're going to set this right. And there were more Shia, but they were in the dominated position. So now all of a sudden they rose up, and now then with power, all of a sudden they start going against the Sunni side who had the power. Now they don't. And it didn't happen at first. If you know your history of how this thing actually spawned, the Sunnis didn't explode right away. In fact, it didn't start till around 2005. We invaded in 2003, late 2004, 2005. We had a chance to try and make those two folks work together. But the Shia were now saying, okay, now that we have the power, we're going to oppress the Sunni the same way that they did us. And now then the side that had the power and now doesn't, they took now the only path they had, which was violence. And so they rose up in an insurgency, and you all know what happened after that. In the situation here, there is a demographic shift going on in the United States. And the United States has always been a predominantly white society. And when you have what has been, especially the male white population has dominated the landscape. And really, you can go back decades back and you can say, I mean, it was everything. It was political, it was sports, it was the entertainment industry, et cetera. And now all of that is shifting, and it scares a lot. And I'm not here to make pros or cons or say anybody's right or wrong. I'm just talking to you about the demographic shifts that are physically happening. And that is that especially many of the white population, percentage-wise, are now shrinking as some of the others are gaining in numbers and in prestige. And so there is this fear of losing the position that's making many, especially on the white right, to move against. Now, this is not a condemnation of anybody that's white or on the right, as I consider myself to be. But it is something that we need to be aware of. We got to be honest about it, because it is happening and it is scaring a lot of people. Whether justly or unjustly, just understand it only matters their perception. It doesn't, in this case, matter as much what's really going on in terms of whether they're going to be losing power or simply just a smaller portion, but still have the same rights, et cetera. There is a fear that they're going to be losing power. And this is covered by many writers. This is not just me saying this, is not just my personal opinion. This is by research and evidence to show that this is what's the case. And that is exacerbating the fear of many on the right, and why they support a lot of these policies, because they see the left, who is very much, as I mentioned earlier, in the diversity, equity, and all that kind of stuff. And so they see the left as being, that's one of the reasons they see them as existential, because they see them wanting to not just change their life, but push them down and keep them down. That's their impression. That's their belief anyway. And so that is rising. Now, the left side, for its side, sees these guys as a threat, because they think that DEI and all that is how it's supposed to be. But instead, they're viewing each other as an existential threat. And when you have this tinderbox already of the division, and then you think that the other side is a threat, and you start losing the trust in the institutions to solve problems, you see, again, we run into more of the risk of violence. I want to show you a couple of clips from a Dr. Pape, who's was just an exceptional author from the University of Chicago. has studied insurgency as well. I read much of his work during my time of fighting in some of these counterinsurgencies that we did, because he did some exceptional work on getting into the minds of the people on the very side, so you understand how to maybe have a good policy to try to bring those conflicts to a conclusion. Well, he's used some of his same research methods also currently on the United States, and has some very, very interesting things. Earlier this year, he did an examination and a research on some of the people who were in the January 6th uprising, and again, not the kind of people you would have expected.
What's so striking in this case is that 2/3 of the over now 420 who have been arrested are over the age of 34. We have the concentration in the early 40s. That is, people who are in their 40s and 50s. They have families, they have jobs, they are mature adults. This is a very different picture than what we've seen before. Further, when we drill into not just what we can see on TV, but with this large research team at the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, we're able to track the occupations. And what we find are 45% are CEOs, business owners, doctors, lawyers, accountants, mid-level managers. We have a State Department official. This is a very different pattern than we're used to seeing before.
I'm sorry, I said earlier this year. You see, that was 2021. But that was his analysis of the people that were arrested for January 6th uprising in the Capitol. And so you see, it's not just a bunch of ne'er-do-wells. These are educated people. These are highly competent people, but people who fear their way of life is being threatened by another side, and they were willing to take this kind of action. Now, you wonder, all right, January 6th was a relatively small section. Well, 2 days ago, Dr. Pape was again interviewed. People kind of wanted to see where he was prior to this election here. And I want you to pay attention to the scale of how many people have gone more now in the 3 years since he made that previous comment when he talked about what's the case today.
Our most recent survey is September, just about a month ago. September 16th is when it came out of the field. And we found that 6% of American adults, that's the equivalent of 15 million American adults, support the use of force to restore Donald Trump to the presidency. And 8% of American adults support the use of force to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president. Now, these numbers matter because support for political violence can nudge volatile actors who are, for their own psychosocial reasons, on the edge of violence, over that edge and take action. And this can happen because that support for political violence I just identified often shows up in social media.
Now, don't miss this. There's been a lot of important things that I've conveyed here. Don't miss the scale here. 6% of Americans would use violence to get Trump into office by whatever means. 8% would use violence to keep Trump from going into office. So you're talking, he said 6 was equivalent of 15 million or so. So 8 is whatever, 18, 20 million, whatever that number is. So you're talking 30 to 35 million Americans have said or believe that using violence to either get Trump in or keep him out of office would be something that they would consider. And as he highlighted there's a number of other people who were kind of on the fence. But if you see lots of people taking action and start to doing some of this, you can see it wouldn't take much to get more. Do you understand that? You're talking millions of people would be willing to do this. January 6th, I think the total of 400 some odd people were arrested from that date. I don't know what the total number that were involved, but 400 were arrested. So a relatively small number in one incident. But now then, you've got 4 more years for all this stuff to percolate. You've had 4 more years for those divisions to move even further apart. And more people on now both sides willing to say they're willing to use force. Now, where would that come from? I mean, it's not just going to come out. It's not going to be people who just meet on the mall and then go and charge into a building. Now then, they've taken a lot more preparation for this. There has been the rise for actually quite a number of years now, well predating 2020, to where local militias in various parts of the country have been rising up. There is this whole movement to, hey, you have to protect yourself. And there's this, you go on Amazon, you can see huge numbers of people selling survival gear, survival food. You know, you've got to be able to live if the government collapses or whatever. People are actively thinking this and spending a lot of money to be able to look forward to this. So that, again, lowers the threshold of movement because you think it may be coming as well. And it's not just people wanting to protect themselves. As you may know, there are more guns in America than there are people. The only nation on the planet that's like that. And there's 330 some odd million Americans. So just imagine how many guns, both legal and illegal, are actually in the country here. I've seen one estimate say it could be as high as 500 million. As more than a million are undocumented weapons that have been built in kits or just purchased illegally. Lots of people, there's trillions of rounds of ammunition. By one report I saw. So there is a lot of physical capacity. And some of these militias are taking more and more action and talking about ways to prepare for what may come after this election. Watch this one.
If Biden gets elected and there's no civil uprising, this country's screwed.
While selling weapons at a gun show in Fishersville, military veteran Paul Voska told us he's starting a militia in Augusta County, Virginia.
Let's just say, and this has happened, you have a police department is corrupt, and you have local government that's corrupt. The militia, being on the right side of the community and the Constitution and established laws in this country, would present a force or an intimidation like, hey, listen, this ain't right.
There's several parts of what he said there which are crucial to hear. He's saying that if these government officials and these government entities don't do the right thing, then we could use force to make the laws of America enforced. So he is setting himself up, and many others are as well, that they will now supersede because the trust in the institutions, whether it's the police, as he mentioned there, the local governments, the federal government, he's now doesn't believe enough in their legitimacy so that if they don't do what he thinks they ought to do, if they don't enforce the laws the way he thinks they ought to enforce them, maybe I need to use some of these guns that I have here. And that's just one. And I assure you, there is a whole lot more. There are more on the right than there are on the left. But as this next clip shows, they are on the left and growing.
The bottom line is this group says that the U.S. government, as well as law enforcement, simply does not do enough to protect Black Americans in this country, which is why they say they're taking matters into their own hands. And interestingly, Mika, this is a group that is growing. They say they now boast recruits in nearly every single state. So we decided to go and embed with them and see exactly what they're doing and why. Take a listen. The sounds of war. Right here at home. This is the NFAC, an all-Black militia with a mission to defend the Black community by any means necessary.
So this is training for one of the new chapters.
Yes. Appearing by the hundreds at protests from Stone Mountain, Georgia to Louisville, Kentucky, demanding justice for police killings and countering what they believe is the threat of right-wing militias.
You caught that last part, countering what they think is the threat from right-wing militias. So that one I just showed you was from a Virginia guy on the right, talking about how he doesn't trust the government or the police, so he wants to take matters into his own hands. Then this group from the left said they don't trust the right-wing groups, and maybe not the police either from a different perspective, don't think that they can protect them, so they want to be ready to protect by any means necessary. And look, those were some stunning images. I don't know if you remember those. That was from 2021, to where you had these guys just marching down the public streets with all those weapons. I mean, looking for every bit like an army and a military rolling through there. Now, none of those exploded at the time. I was really worried about that when I saw it, that all it would take was one spark. One person firing into that crowd or something. One guy from the right, for example, taking exception and taking action. And then all of a sudden you have all these guys with all this testosterone and all these high emotions rolling in. And I assure you, they would not be discriminate in their response. And see, we avoided any of that at that point. But now then you're adding 4 more years and more of these groups forming. You heard the anchor there talking about how, or the reporter, that this was in like all 50 states. And of course, they're only growing since that time. You can imagine how much they're growing today. And then when you know, or when you look further and you see that the trust in government is at an all-time low, it's one of the worst that it's been. It's been deteriorating for quite some time. And now that it's just about as low as it's been. And as this poll here shows, the trust in government, right ahead of the election, nearly 2/3 of Americans do not trust the federal government, a share that has increased over the last 2 years and marked a period of near record low confidence in the country's political institutions. When you combine a historic low trust in the institutions of government with historic high levels of animosity between an increasingly divided country, you can see that it would not take much to spark something here and to make this issue explode into it. I just gave you one example there of that, the scenes from, you saw when all those, that black militia had all those guns out there. You can just imagine if one guy had taken action against them and fired rounds into the group here. And then you would have had them all returning fire. And, you know, it's not like a trained military where you have fire control and control among the leadership or whatever. So they're only taking, like the U.S. military would, of precision strike. And, you know, if you don't have positive identification, they call it PID, you don't return fire, et cetera, rules of engagement. You're probably not going to have any of that in there. You'd probably have a free for all. And I assure you, once you see something like that, and then the police come cracking down in there, you have a lot of violence and bloodshed. Something like that could explode in our country. And then these other right militias that are in all these other states would probably start swelling, because they're saying, look, you saw what these guys tried to do to our side. So we have to match up. You see that the police couldn't stop that. Or the left will say, look, the police came after us. Instead of, you know, trying to get the guy that actually did the firing, they came after us. And now then we're all in jail, et cetera. So they're going to start rising too. So you see that once a big trigger is hit, which we haven't had yet, then this thing could explode, because all the pieces are already in place, folks, all over the country. You've got ideologies that are irreconcilable. You've got hatred that's going off the charts and still growing. You've got this belief that your side is going to win in this election, and both sides think the opposite, and only one of them is going to be right, and one of them is going to be very, very disappointed. Now, I think that probably if there's any post-election violence, it would happen if Trump loses. I think the biggest risk of near-term violence comes if Trump loses on Tuesday, or whenever they announce the election. Probably won't be on Tuesday. I imagine with a lot of these mail-in ballots that are at record highs in some states, it'll probably be a few days before it is announced. And even then, especially in some of the swing states, if it's really, really close, they'll get recounts, and then that'll drag it out a number of days. You'll have lawsuits probably and all kinds of accusations, anything. But once it's finally announced, if Trump comes up on the losing edge, then I think the chance for near-term violence is very, very high, because January 6th will be nothing, because now then they'll be convinced that the only way that we can secure our country is through violence. If it's the other way around, if Trump is the one that has declared victory, I think that the chance of near-term violence is much lower, because the left side is not prepared for that. The left side is, even on these polls, the number of polls I showed you, you saw when it's talked about the number of Republicans think they're going to win big, the number of Republicans who think the other side is existential threat is much higher than the Democratic side. It's a solid number over there, but it's still notably smaller. So I don't think there's a smaller number of militia. But if they lose confidence that they can win the next election legally and fairly, then the chance goes up otherwise. And then if you have any kind of protest or so like this one, and all it will take is just one big spark. And what could some of these sparks look like, aside from that one right there? What could actually spark? If there is potentially to be a civil war, always the question is, well, how does it start? I mean, the Civil War, the first one that we had was when the raid at Fort Sumter. That was kind of the initial shots that were fired. So what might be something like that this time? Well, it could be something like, another January 6th. Again, if Trump loses, that'll be a real flashpoint, because that's where it's going to be selected. You know that because I've already seen there's many people out there on the right who are making videos and sharing all kinds of stuff saying that they're willing to use violence to keep January 6th from being the date. That's the date when we have to certify the election by the Constitution. And if we don't, and then these people may take some action to try and prevent that. So there'll be some real damage then. And again, there's been those who are advocated for preventing that from happening. It could also be a domestic terror event, somebody taking action and going after somebody on the left, some key political figure, maybe not the president-elect. It could be anybody else, some member of the Senate, some member of Congress. On either side, something could happen. It could just spark this explosion in here. A 2008 style financial meltdown. Because now then there'll be there's so many conspiracy theories about our government, things that they're doing, things that the political elite, the financial elite are doing, that they're keeping the little guy down on whichever side, that kind of thing. And when you have desperate people, if you see a lot of the rich people having a lot and not suffering, if there's any kind of a meltdown, well, the regular people are, that's going to take the already tinderbox and could explode it as well. A war abroad, one of the things that none of these books looked at. As you see, we talk about on this channel quite a lot. If we get sucked into a war in the Middle East and it starts going south, or if we get sucked into a war with Russia, and even if it doesn't go to nuclear weapons, but if we get involved conventionally and we lose, and as I argue that there is a much higher chance of that than anybody recognizes, that because we can't sustain a war, or even China, and if we lose a war, that could also spur division at home and a rebellion. It's happened many times before in countries. So we're not immune to those kinds of things. We have been a great country. We got some great folks here, but we're not immune to these kinds of things. As I think one of the speakers I showed you earlier said, the laws of gravity work for America just like they do for anybody else. And the laws of interaction of humanity also pay attention here. So many things could cause one of the sparks. The issue is the tinderbox. In the 60s and 70s, a lot of people say we've been here before. We had political assassinations in the 60s and 70s, JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King Jr., major issues. There was lots of violence before those. But here's the big thing. When you look back at those times, and I did, the level of trust in government during those times was a lot higher than it is right now. So people, even though they took to the streets and lots of protests, many of them did use violence in some regards. It was directed and targeted for the most part. And still people had this belief that the government can fix things, that the next election we can get the right people in office, and then maybe that can solve the problem. And then in the late 70s and then in the 80s, things completely calmed back down. And we had, through the 90s, things were relatively at peace. And so now then there's this belief that, well, we can endure that again. But here's the difference. There was not anywhere near the hatred. As I told you earlier, the difference between Republicans and Democrats in the 60s and 70s was not that big a difference. They both had a general same view of the country. That's not the case anymore. So if we have something similar now as we had in the 60s and 70s, the tinder that they're talking about, the fuel that you need for a civil war, is much higher. And if you look at an electoral map, the blue America and the red America, you can see that this is not going to be a north and south kind of deal. This is going to be something to where it could be city against all the rural area in the same state, even neighbor against neighbor, neighborhood against neighborhood. I mean, this could be really, really bad. And I'm telling you, folks, if we start getting into a situation to where the civil control of our lives breaks down, the local police, the National Guard, the U.S. military, that people don't recognize the authority of different countries, then you're going to have the possibility for widespread violence. And there are already significant percentage-wise views that certain states could secede. And if the rule of law breaks down and if chaos starts to reign, then historically people always look to a strong man, somebody to set things right. And if you start from the position that you don't trust the government, then you may say, you know what, then we don't need this government. Let's take our own. California and Texas are two of the bigger ones, but they're not the only ones. And then people may have to start choosing sides, because if enough of these people who already exist can say, I told you we should have done this earlier. Nobody listened to me. Now look at all this violence. The only ones who are going to fix this is us. We have to form our own, another Texas nation again, a California nation, because they're, red and blue, they're never going to work together again. So let's just separate. And then with this way, everybody who lives here believes what we do. And if you don't believe, hit the road there, Jack. Move to this other country here. And you'll see that kind of thing could happen all over the place. And once this thing starts coming apart, wow, it is going to be damn near impossible to keep together. The only hope we have is to never let it get to this point. What I'm hoping that you can do by seeing the facts and the physical evidence that I had presented before you here is that we are in much higher risk than you may believe. And even though we don't want this to be true, so we kind of ignore it, it can be true. And the threat is very, very real. And you can see that I've only touched on a handful of ways that this could go south. There's probably no end to the number of things unexpected that I can't even conceive of here that could take this tinder, this fuel, and ignite it in ways that just can't be controlled once it goes in that direction. So I've heard many people, and they say this really every time, this is the most consequential election in our history. Well, this one is, only not for the reason any of these people think. It doesn't matter if Kamala Harris wins. It doesn't matter if Donald Trump wins. It only matters what happens next. And because of this division, no matter how the election comes out, half the country is going to feel cheated, and the risk of civil war is going to rise. And so what we've got to do is we have got to start lowering the temperature. We've got to, even amongst ourselves, we've got to start recognizing, hey, this thing could get out of hand quickly. I want the country to be better, but I also don't want to lose it. I like our vision of things, but I don't want to be so zeroed in on this one that I end up hating my fellow American and get into a situation where some in my camp may kill the other side there, and then we all lose it. Everybody could lose it. This great country that we have, one of the most amazing that's ever existed, it could just be shattered overnight if we're not very, very careful. I'm going to do everything I can. Gary and I, with this channel and others who are similarly aligned, we want the country to survive. If we want a country that continues to be free, has freedom of expression, people can live however they want. If they want to live like a blue, they can. If they want to live like a red, they can. But it must be to where both sides allow the others to express themselves and to coexist together. Even if it's right now just tolerating the other side, that's a step in the right direction. But I'm just telling you, folks, however much you may want the country to be your version of a red or a blue or any other kind of category, it cannot come at the expense of the other side. And if we don't stop viewing the other side as the enemy, then we're going to find that we are enemies one day. And again, once that spark is ignited and once that fuel starts to burn, it is going to be very, very difficult to smolder it, put it down. The best thing we can do is to make sure it never gets ignited. And I do not underestimate, I'm not saying I'm no pie in the sky here about how easy this is going to be, because it's been decades in the building here. But if we don't at least start decades more tamping it down and moving it down, we could destroy everything for which we have built. That's your deep dive for today, folks. I appreciate you watching today. We're going to have Andrei Martyanov later on today. He's going to be talking about how Iran has been vowing to, quote, teeth-breaking response to Israel. And we thought we might have dodged a bullet on that one. Well, maybe the bullet just is coming later. We're going to talk about what that means and what we need to be watching out for this afternoon at 3 p.m. Be sure and join us then. Like and subscribe if you haven't. And I'll look forward to seeing you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.